I'm Andreas Andersson. I'm a professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and today I will be talking about how anthropogenic carbon dioxide will affect shallow water calcium carbonate sediment dissolution. And what I mean by shallow water sediments, I'm talking about environments like the one you can see here, which is a shallow sand flat in a coral reef environment, where the sediments are made up of almost 100% biogenic calcium carbonate. First of all, I would like to acknowledge my various collaborators and co-authors that have contributed to this talk one way or the other, as well as the various funding agencies. It is a tremendous honor to have been selected to give the Berner lecture this year, although I would have much preferred to give it in Hawaii rather than in front of my computer here in San Diego. Hawaii was actually the place where I met Bob Berner for the first time, and this was during the Geochemistry of the Earth's Surface meeting in 2001. And I still remember our first interactions where I, as a first-year graduate student, was manning the bar at the welcoming reception, and Berner came up and asked me to make him a gin and tonic, which I did. Luckily, I had many more opportunities to interact with Berner, as he used to spend several weeks in Hawaii every winter visiting Fred Mackenzie. I think it was during one of these meetings when we talked about calcium carbonate dissolution for the first time, as I was showing him some data from Devil's Hole in Bermuda. Devil's Hole is a really interesting place because it becomes stratified every summer. So you get a surface mixed layer and a subthermocline layer. And any organic matter that's remineralized in the subthermocline layer drives really high PCO2 conditions, shown here in the black, and low aragonite saturation state, shown here in the blue, and also low pH conditions. So the topic of our conversation was whether we could use this environment as a natural laboratory to study how a future higher CO2 world might affect calcium carbonate dissolution. So this was in the early 2000s. The atmospheric CO2 was approximately 375 parts per million, as you can see here from the Keeling curve. Berner himself had spent significant time in Bermuda in the 60s and 70s studying both calcium carbonate dissolution and precipitation, mainly in the context of early diagenesis. He also made significant contributions to dissolution, and there were a series of seminal papers in the early 70s together with Pat Wild and John Morse investigating the dissolution kinetics of calcium carbonate in seawater. He also made significant contributions to the influence of magnesium on calcium carbonate dissolution, and the solubility of calcite and aragonite in seawater, and also the various controls of mineral dissolution. A couple of years before we had our conversation about dissolution, Joni Kleypas and colleagues had published a paper titled Geochemical Consequences of Increased Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide on Coral Reefs. And what these authors had pointed out was that as the atmospheric CO2 was increasing, the saturation state with respect to carbonate minerals would decrease in the surface seawater. So what the panel here to the left is showing how the aragonite saturation state will change under different CO2 conditions from 400, 550, and 900 parts per million, where the red colors represents a lower aragonite saturation state. The take-home message is as the CO2 goes up, the aragonite saturation state goes down. In the panel to the right here, you can see the number of reefs exposed to a given aragonite saturation state under different atmospheric CO2 conditions. So for example, in the bottom panel here at 900 parts per million, we can see that the majority of coral reefs are exposed to an aragonite saturation state of about 2 or lower. However, the initial concern about these changes in chemistry was initially focused on the effect on marine calcifiers. This figure shows how calcification by different coral species is affected by changing aragonite saturation states. which is shown here on the x-axis, and the relative rate of calcification on the y-axis. What we can see is that as aragonite saturation decreases, the rate of calcification decreases, although there's a different sensitivity between different species. However, just a year after the Kleypas paper, there were a couple of abstracts submitted to the International Coral Reef Symposium that suggested that solution of reef rock buffers seawater against rising atmospheric CO2, or will reef sediments buffer corals from increased global CO2? So the idea with these papers was that as the saturation state decreased, metastable carbonate minerals, preferentially the magnesium calcites, would rapidly dissolve and buffer the seawater and thereby prevent any negative effects on marine calcifiers. This hypothesis was often referred to as the magnesium salivation theory. And this was actually my initiation to calcium carbonate dissolution and where my interest for this question started. So as a first-year graduate student, I was working on developing a simple biogeochemical box model together with Fred McKenzie and Maver, trying to quantitatively assess this hypothesis. So without getting into the details of this model, we essentially concluded that yes, dissolution of metastable carbonate minerals will increase in a higher CO2 world, but they would not produce sufficient alkalinity fast enough to produce a significant buffer effect on timescales of decades to centuries. However, we did find that the calcium carbonate dissolution, shown here by the green line, at some point would increase so much and exceed the calcium carbonate production, shown here by the red line. And this simulation was for global coastal ocean. There are now other papers showing similar results, and specifically there are studies of coral reef environments suggesting that coral reefs will transition to a condition of net dissolution. So here's just a couple of examples. So Jack Silverman and colleagues, they used a numerical model and concluded that coral reefs may start dissolving when atmospheric CO2 doubles. In the other paper here, Brad Ear and colleagues, they used incubation chambers deployed in situ in permeable carbonate sediments. And here, aragonite saturation state shown on the x-axis, the rate of dissolution on the y-axis. And as you can see, as the saturation state decreases, the rate of sediment dissolution increases. And at aragonite saturation state of about 3, there's this transition from net calcification to net dissolution. There is a growing body of evidence showing similar results, and for example, that calcium carbonate dissolution will increase in response to anthropogenic CO2. The dissolution process appears to be more sensitive than biogenic calcification, and coral reefs are likely to transition to net dissolution. However, it's not completely obvious why is calcium carbonate dissolution increasing and what is driving this increase, especially considering that the surface seawater will remain super saturated with respect to most of the commonly occurring carbonate phases on coral reefs, even if we burn most of the conventional fossil fuels. So for the remainder of the talk, I will focus on this, the why question of why it's increasing. So as seawater flows over a coral reef, marine calcifiers, they take up calcium ions and magnesium ions and inorganic carbon to make calcareous structures of calcium carbonate. Organic matter is also produced as well as oxygen. The reverse processes of respiration actually breaks down most of the organic material, and some of the calcium carbonate also dissolves. However, these processes are typically separated in time, with net calcification and net primary production dominating during the day, and net respiration and increased dissolution taking place at night. They're also separated between different habitats, where the forereef and the rim reef are dominant for the constructive processes, and dissolution and respiration preferentially take place in back reef environments, in the lagoon, in sandy sediments, etc. Despite the fact that the seawater is super saturated with respect to the mineral phases that organisms produce, the actual production of this calcium carbonate takes place in tiny spaces within the calcifiers. So this schematic is trying to illustrate a general model of what this typically looks like. So most calcifiers, they have a calcifying space that is on the order of nanometers to micrometers. It contains a calcifying fluid, so the organisms get seawater into this space. They then use various ion pumps, for example, the calcium ATPase pump, to pump out hydrogen ions and introduce calcium ions. What this does is bringing up the pH and the saturation state with respect to carbonate minerals to create a more favorable, a chemically more favorable environment to precipitate calcium carbonate. Most organism also has an organic matrix that assists in the nucleation and the growth of the calcium carbonate. The dissolution process is remarkably similar to the calcification process, although in the reverse order here. So here's a schematic of some carbonate sediments where we have different grains of different grain size. There's some organic matter entrained. There may also be organic matter entrained or covering the surfaces of some of these grains. So again, we have a very small space. So it's restricted. The water flow through this small dissolution space is very restricted. Within this fluid, we have microbes that are remineralizing organic matter, producing acid that results in a decrease in pH and the saturation state with respect to carbonate minerals. This will decrease until the water becomes undersaturated with respect to the most soluble mineral phase present in the sediments that then will start to dissolve. So what does this look like in the real environment? So I'm going to show an example from Bermuda where we have carbonate chemistry samples, both from the surface seawater across the reef and also from the pore water in the carbonate sediments. So in the graph to the left here, total alkalinity is shown on the y-axis, dissolved inorganic carbon shown on the x-axis, and the color bar represents the aragonite saturation state. So as the water flows over the reef, we can see that total alkalinity and DAC are decreasing in relatively equal proportion. So what's happening here is that calcification is taking up alkalinity and DAC in a ratio of 2 to 1, and organic carbon production decreases mainly just DAC. If we look at the pore water data shown here by the white data symbols, the surface seawater is shown here by the black. What happens here is that as the surface seawater enters the pore water, we have decomposition of organic matter that is producing DIC and lowering the saturation state with respect to aragonite. So this will take place until the pore water becomes undersaturated with respect to the most soluble bulk mineral field present in the sediments, which then will start to dissolve. This is what we refer to as metabolic dissolution, where the aerobic decomposition of organic matter results in stoichiometrically proportional dissolution of calcium carbonate, resulting in an increase of alkalinity and DAC in a ratio of 1 to 1. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, most of the dissolution is controlled by the extent of aerobic decomposition of organic matter beyond the solubility of the most soluble bulk mineral phase. The surface seawater saturation state is very important because the greater the offset between the surface saturation state and the solubility threshold, the greater the accumulation of calcium carbonate. So what will happen in a future higher CO2 world? So in a higher CO2 world, the surface seawater DAC concentration will be higher. Consequently, there's less organic material required to be decomposed to reach the solubility threshold. Once this is reached, again, there will be dissolution, but there will be more organic matter available to drive dissolution, so resulting in an increasing amount of total dissolution. So even though seawater saturation state will remain supersaturated with respect to most of the commonly occurring carbonate phases, the calcium carbonate dissolution will increase. And this is because there's an increasing proportion of aerobic decomposition organic matter that will be available to drive dissolution. So do we have any additional support for these hypothesized mechanisms? Well, we can make a few predictions that can be evaluated. For example, that calcium carbonate sediment dissolution increases as a function of decreasing surface seawater saturation state. And secondly, dissolution threshold vary as a function of the solubility of the most soluble bulk mineral phase present in the sediments. The first prediction here, I think there are many studies supporting, but perhaps most clearly the study by Iredol that clearly shows that the dissolution shown on the y-axis increases as a function of the aragonite saturation state shown here on the x-axis for 5 different, very different coral reef environments. The second prediction is perhaps a little bit more challenging because it's very difficult to identify the solubility of the most soluble bulk mineral phase present in the sediments. But if we look at pore water data from 4 different locations, we can clearly see that the solubility threshold and the aragonite saturation state within the pore water happens at different levels, essentially. If we then look at these data as a function of the mole percent magnesium carbonate of the average magnesium calciphate in the sediment shown here on the x-axis, the dissolution threshold of the average aragonite saturation state shown here on the y-axis, we can see that there's a trend of increasing aragonite saturation state as a function of increasing mole percent magnesium carbonate or increasing solubility, which also supports the hypothesis. However, some caution is advised as well. First of all, it's a limited data set, but there's also many different factors that can affect the solubility in addition to the magnesium calcite. So to wrap things up, in conclusion, as a result of rising anthropogenic CO2, shallow water calcium carbonate dissolution will increase because an increasing proportion of organic matter decomposition will be available to drive calcium carbonate sediment dissolution. The surface seawater saturation state is important because it controls the amount of decomposition required to reach the solubility threshold of the most soluble bulk carbonate mineral phase. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.